class, which I hope will serve as an introduction to the final practice learning experience for mentors and a recap for the apprentices. So what will we talk about today? We will talk about requirements of the FPLE, some resources that might be of use, and a little bit, a very brief synopsis of a much longer session we did in class about looking after yourself and others, but a little bit of criticality included. And then thinking about critical analysis, which is one of the main focuses of the module this year, and 2 assignments required around that. So the FPLE is assessed at the end of last placement or final placement level of the PCF. That's a much, much more developed set of standards than, for example, at the start of the course. And apprentices also need to have met the Skills England standards, which previously were called the IATE standards. Same thing, essentially just a different branding. The FPLE will be 100 days, presumably or ideally undertaking more complex work than has previously been undertaken. And it should build on learning from the contrasting learning experience last year. And if there was an action plan or anything of that nature in the final review last year, that should be taken into account now. So the settings for the FPLE, quite typically, people return to their base team and stay in the same throughout, but do not have to. We have to write the program to take into account the many different delivery models in different agencies across London. We have at least 30 employers involved in the program, and people do things differently, surprise, surprise. So if in doubt, ask your SRA, sub-regional assessor, or myself as on-the-job practice learning lead. But generally, we can incorporate flexibility in how things are done. Quite often, the 100 days will be in one team, but we use that opportunity of a slightly extended placement to ensure that apprentices have opportunities, even if they are brief, in other parts of the service that they might not be familiar with and might be interested in. Again, negotiation. I suppose the guiding principle, the FPLE must enable the apprentice to evidence their practice against relevant professional standards, and it's not just the PCF and Skills England standards, by the end of the 100 days to show that they have some understanding of the Social Work England professional standards. We don't ask them to collate evidence against the standards, but to have an understanding of those. And in fact, there will be in-class activities to try to achieve that. So when planning for the FPLE, obviously, an agreement, an FPLE agreement or mentor agreement should be in place. And I would advise spending a fair bit of time on that. It sets out really what you're planning to do for the rest of the year. There is a little bit of guidance from Social Work England on placements that might be useful, but at this stage, mostly both mentors and apprentices are kind of aware of what is required, and of course will be aware of their own individual learning needs and interests. You might do an induction. If a person is moving to a new team, then you most certainly would do an induction. We would recommend that inductions, if you're going to a different part of the same service, you probably need at least a week and possibly 2. And if you're moving to something that's very unfamiliar, then 2 weeks is probably going to be a good idea. So there are some guidelines about the FPLE in general, but usually the idea is to start with about a 50% caseload from the start, and that can increase to the maximum of 80% by the end of the FPLE. There's always a balance to be struck. The apprentice's learning needs should be the key driver here. Different people go at different paces and have different needs. So again, it's a process of collaboration and negotiation usually ends up with the best results. So as ever, apprentices are learners. They're not there to plug gaps. God knows there's enough gaps in social work teams, and some teams clearly are going to struggle more than others. Periodically, it kind of goes up and down over time. So we know we have to be realistic, and we know the apprentices are skilled and experienced, but they are not a safe pair of hands to plug gaps that exist. I didn't mention the photographs, some of the photographs on this, but they come from a photographer called Rosie Barnes, who did a project with a local authority down in South London about care. And the first slide that you saw here with the nail filing is about that. It's about working with older people, and sometimes, of course, it's about loss and bereavement. So there's something about care that should really underpin all our social work practice. And I'd advise you go and have a little look. This is Willard, a portrait of his wife. I think this picture speaks for itself. So obviously there is a need for reflective time on the placement, and apprentices should be provided with 2 hours a week within the FPLE for the whole period. Now, you can agree, negotiate, discuss how that time might be used. Some people prefer half an hour a day. Some people tend to take it in a block, whatever is suitable for all concerned, because people may have, for example, caring responsibilities that mean the half hour is going to work better or whatever. But the time should be used constructively. Quite often people use that for updating their index of evidence, for kind of writing in their reflective journals, things of that nature. So it should be used for course activities, essentially learning activities. That will probably help also in the links to critical analysis assignments, which I'm going to come on to shortly. That's obviously reflective practice in general is essential part, core part of professional practice and development. And of course, supervision has a role to play on that. Now, supervision, some recent research on supervision suggests that we perhaps make a mistake if we rely on, for example, a line manager and a worker to be the only place or the sole place or the most important place where supervision takes place. So that reflection, of course, can happen in many different ways. And it's possible that the apprentice might be involved with a line manager, a mentor, and an on-site supervisor, as well as the sub-regional assessor. So the FPLE is a good opportunity really to kind of work out what kind of supervision is going to happen and when it might happen, what frequency, etc. This is a suggestion about how that might work, but we're not definitive. We offer suggestions rather than rules, if you see what I mean. But the idea is that there should be regular reflective supervision throughout the whole of the FPLE. It should be responsive, and it should be demanding. We are kind of trying to push the envelope. Our approach is what we call scaffolding or constructivist learning, which means that we're continually looking to kind of expand our learning experience, knowledge, skills. So it should be authoritative in this little box here. Because the other forms of supervision have weaknesses that we're basically trying to avoid. Now, in the mentoring agreement, there is a little kind of opening section that gives you roles and responsibilities of the different people involved. The mentoring agreement does look a little different in that regard, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that now, but I'm not going to go through it line by line. But I would advise you that when you are doing the mentoring agreement, have a quick look at that, have a read through, make sure you have a mutual understanding. There's also a on-the-job learning handbook, which we've recently updated, and I think that's probably a good source of evidence or advice or guidance for a whole series of things that we couldn't cover in a short video like today. So for apprentices, it's on their Canvas module, and for mentors, we will send this out by email with some other supporting documents that we hope might be useful. So the roles and responsibilities look like this. You can see complete FPLE agreement, review progress and learning, establish open and constructive learning environment, and so on and so forth. Nothing hugely surprising there. In a similar way, the mentor and on-site supervisor, a slightly longer list, I will admit. But one thing here, I suppose, stands out is that the mentor or on-site supervisor is required to do one direct observation during the FPLE. And that usually happens in the second half of the FPLE. So that would be sometime from perhaps January, February, March, maybe is probably a good target time to kind of aim for that. There are index of evidence that needs to be signed off, and it should be seen by the mentor or the on-site supervisor on a fairly regular basis, just to keep that ticking over as much as anything else. There's also a day tracker. Social work England's requirements are that the full 100 days must be completed. Mainly, that's not an issue, that isn't a problem, but occasionally it can be. So if in doubt, ask us. Sometimes what happens is a person is in a position to submit their portfolio, but still has a few days less to do. That's okay. That's all fine. The same with any of these things. If we keep on talking to each other about them, we're likely to be able to make it work, really. The SRA has certain responsibilities, and generally they are responsible for the overall assessment of on-the-job learning in the FPLE and in the other years. So that hasn't changed really, and they will do a direct observation, usually in the first term, somewhere between September and December, roughly speaking, like that. Lots of negotiations to be done, but generally not too contentious. The idea is that the SRA sets the tone. I would expect a little bit more from these direct observations, um, kind of more sharp, shall we say, identification of any learning needs, possibly feedback that would include reading literature, suggested for training, or whatever it happened to be. So we're trying to kind of nuance those learning needs and opportunities that are appropriate for a student who is, or an apprentice who is coming to the end of their studies. The on-site supervisors' roles and responsibilities are similar to the the mentors. And in a lot of cases, there won't be an on-site supervisor, but we put this in just in case there is. And as I said, I do not intend to go through this line by line, but worth reading it. Line managers, of course, because they're responsible for, usually anyway, responsible for the allocation of work. That person needs to be on board, and so hence we give some guidance about that. And what is new this time is the learning and development workforce lead. Now, because we're coming to the end of the course, if there's any concerns about a person passing the placement or not, as the case may be, we need a kind of early heads up to the learning and development lead, because, you know, if you leave it too late, there isn't the time or the opportunity to put support measures in place for an apprentice who might, for various reasons, and they can be many, why progress isn't happening at the rate we would expect it to. You cannot repeat the FPLE. So the apprenticeship program is a little bit different from other routes, social work training routes, in that you can't multiply repeat placements. So you can see if you actually don't pass this placement, that's going to be very problematic. Now, that rarely happens, but of course we have to consider in our kind of rules, regulations, guidance, structure, etc., the possibility that might happen. And that's part of the reason why the L&D lead is included specifically here for the first time over 3 years. We give indicative timescales when things should be done. This is a handout to the apprentices, and it will be sent as an attachment to the mentors. So it's a kind of rough guideline to kind of keep everybody on track. There is some flexibility in these days, particularly with formative or draft assignments. But at the same time, we would advise trying to stick to the timetable, because, you know, we designed it in that way so that, I suppose, it tries not to clash with other assignments, taught assignments in class and things of that nature, and tries to get the timing right so that, in particular, we have a good run in to the final review, the final elements of the portfolio to be put together. Right now, at this present moment in time, this is at the start of the term. It's October when this is being recorded. And again, this will be very similar whatever year when we're talking about the FPLE. You will be also required to do a tripartite agreement. This is part of the APTEM process. Again, apprentices and mentors may be quite familiar with this already. These have to be done 3 times a year. We like to do the first one at the start of the term when the pressure is perhaps less than it will be later on. Then there'll be one at the early part of the new year and one at the very end of the year. And if your SRA hasn't reached out to you yet for that, perhaps you could kind of do a bit of emailing and contacting chivvy people along. At this stage, really, we're negotiating, working out, and dotting the I's and crossing the T's about what's the year going to look like. Many of them have already been started. So, as with other years, there is a final portfolio to be submitted. It's very similar to previous portfolios that people have done. It's just got a little bit more in terms of content. You see what I mean? There's the usual confidentiality statement that just actually comes in. The template just requires to be signed, but we have to be very conscious about GDPR and ensuring that no PLE, people with lived experience, details appear anywhere in the portfolio. The risk then, if that happens, is that the portfolio gets sent back to you and won't be marked. There's the FPLE agreement and review. Now is the time really to be working on that agreement if you haven't already. I know for sure some people have, but you know what I mean. Let's not panic. If you haven't done it already, let's get on it now. There's 2 direct observations, and they both have to be of capable practice. If the observation doesn't have evidence of capable practice, then you're going to have to do that again. You're going to have another opportunity. So setting these things up early is generally a good idea. Mainly, it's not too difficult, but there is a process. You have to get permission from the person with lived experience, the various bits of paperwork to be done, and so on and so forth. And some roles actually don't lend themselves as well to direct observations as others. So I would say front of house roles, for example, where work is coming in initially, just regardless of what kind of service it is, are quite often by the phone or by email and are not really concerned with direct work with people in the sense that you're actually talking to another human being. So in some instances, you might need a little bit more preparation than in others. We need feedback from people with lived experience. They're usually generated by the direct observation, but there are occasions when that doesn't happen for various different reasons. Sometimes a person might be too upset or too exhausted to give feedback, or who knows, there might be a million reasons. But if it isn't generated from the direct observations, it should be generated elsewhere. So we still require 2 feedbacks from people, but they might not always come from the direct observation. An index of evidence is required. There's some slight variation in that this year, in that we have made it more explicit that a person should say what happened, what they did, and what they learned from this. So we're specifically asking people to compile the index of evidence in that way. But really, at the end of the CLE, mostly I saw really good indexes of evidence. So it's kind of continuing on in a similar vein. We ask for 2 feedbacks from professionals. Now, this has to be professionals who are not the SRA, line manager, mentor, or anybody essentially who is involved in supporting the apprentice's learning. Now, because social work is essentially interdisciplinary, interprofessional, quite frequently, almost invariably, I would say, there's lots of opportunities to work with other professionals. There's a standard form for this, and we found that professionals are actually very generous with their time and are quite willing to do this for the learners or for the apprentices. You're not limited to 2. It may be on occasion that, well, at least one person submitted about 8, I think, because they were looking for particular evidence about particular domains and they wanted to strengthen their evidence so that they actually went over and above what was required. But the minimum is 2, and if 2 is what you end up with, that's absolutely fine. Then there's quite a lengthy FPLE review at the end. Again, it should be quite collaborative endeavor, and an attendance record that has to be signed by both the mentor and the apprentice on a regular basis. And the SRA should essentially have overview of all these documents and be keeping track on progress throughout. Now, this year we're going to be asking for 2 critical analysis, and you can see the detail here. Apprentices are allowed to submit formative assignments and get feedback and work on that a little bit more. Now, so what's different about that is the critical analysis bit, because previously we've done reflection, critical reflection, and so on and so forth. But in social work, essentially, a lot of the time you come to a decision where it's going to be yes or no. Will a panel agree funding for an activity? Will a person be able to live here? Will a child be able to stay with their family? Will there be a section of the Mental Health Act? Various processes like this that are legal or quasi-legal, and they come down to a decision, a yes or a no. So to advocate effectively for people, we have to show our analysis, how we came to the decision that we are recommending or wanting to implement. So really, that's what we're aiming for in these assignments, to kind of show you're working out, use decision-making models, research and evidence, and of course the involvement of the person with lived experience and other relevant stakeholders, and you kind of show how you came to that conclusion. So that's essentially what we're asking for. That's kind of a little bit different. There are resources for apprentices. Obviously, there's Canvas module. Mentors generally do not have access to that, but I'll give you a little flavor of the kind of thing we'll do on teaching and recall days. A lot of it, of course, is going to be about, how would I say, progress in the portfolio or the direct observations or answering the million questions that might result from trying to do the best possible job on the FPLE. Those recall days are set in stone. You can see they are in November, February, and April. And there will be a whole series of drop-in online sessions. Now, there will be online sessions both for mentors, so they can ask questions about their role and expectations and so on, and of course for apprentices. The apprentices online sessions are TBC, as they say, to be confirmed, but they will cluster around the various key points when assignments are due. We also have things like the subject specialist librarian, academic success center, and various other resources available to students. So let's have a little think about professional resilience. Now, we spent a lot longer than I am now going to spend on this, talking in class. And my first question is, what is a thought terminating cliche? A thought termination cliche might also be a truism, a banality, bromide, chestnut cliche, etc., etc. One has to wonder sometimes, is some of our professional language a thought terminating cliche? A kind of a handy rule of thumb that supposedly expresses something a little bit more complex and makes it easier for us to communicate with each other. But on occasion, professional language and rules of thumb can get in the way of actually giving a coherent analysis of things like who did what to whom. And sometimes we need to go below or beyond the kind of professional language to say specifically what happened, because otherwise we can tend to end up in trouble. So my question is really, would you really put on your own face mask before your child's face mask? Well, this is what we're told to do. But when we're talking about resilience, we often think about personal resilience. And while that's entirely appropriate, I wonder, should we be talking more about agency or organizational resilience? And is that something that can be embedded in a wider way? And these are debates are not new. And of course, they're not confined to the workplace. They also happen in the university. But when we talk about burnout, what do we mean? Well, the most common way of measuring burnout is by using Maslach's burnout inventory. And there have been various attempts over the years about evaluating stress. There have been House of Commons select committees about workforce in the NHS and social care, etc., etc. You can follow those links if you feel like you'd want to explore it more. But it's obviously something on the public agenda, as it were. So MASLAC actually measures three things: emotional exhaustion, that general feeling of energy depletion, when you wake up in the morning, you're still tired kind of a thing, not very pleasant. Depersonalization, a kind of mental distance from one's job, feeling negative or cynical or kind of going, oh God, do you know what I mean? I'm sure everybody has that feeling sometimes. And a reduced feeling that you're actually doing anything worthwhile or that you have achieved anything. Uh, I'm sure people kind of understand what those things are, but when measuring burnout, it's not one element of the scale that has to score high, it's all three. So there has to be a combination of these things, and then we can call it, not exactly clinically, but we would have a better kind of uh, firmer ground, as it were, for calling what a person is experiencing burnout. So there can be personal and institutional effects. Teams, organizations can also be burnt out. These things have an impact on the quality of care, staff retention, turnover, absenteeism, morale, and of course, individual physical exhaustion, bad sleep, drugs, alcohol, relationship problems. So these things are well rehearsed, and I'm sure you all know what I mean by those things. There's a little slide share link there from Joe Moriarty, who's been writing about social workforce issues for a great many years. And it's a kind of quite in-depth and useful, I think, um, overview of burnout and social work. I should, of course, also acknowledge Jill Manthorpe, again, very well known researcher and academic, particularly in adults, social care, and they're kind of, I guess, synthesizing the evidence that is about there and making some useful suggestions about what you might do about these things. Um, some of the emerging issues from this is it's a bit like professional language and things like that. Resilience and burnout can become cliches that are just trotted out there without really paying care and attention to what they actually mean and is the threshold met, as it were. People change scores, they use it in inappropriate ways, all sorts of things like that, you can imagine. Using bits of it just to diagnose people, it's important to know this is not a medical condition. Burnout is not a medical condition or a disability for that matter. It might actually lead to those things, but of itself, it is not those things. So we have to be wary of kind of identifying people who need to be fixed. The tendency in that instance will be that we're individualizing broader social or organizational problems, and that's not really too helpful. Or a nuanced approach might be needed. So just to recap, burnout, you would have negative scores on exhaustion, cynicism, and professional efficacy, all three domains. A person who was overextended, in other words, they're simply doing too much and there's too much work coming through that, oh, God knows, I'm sure a lot of people would experience that. But that would be a strong negative score on exhaustion only and not the other two domains. That feeling of feeling ineffective, that would be about professional efficacy. Interesting to think, okay, if you feel you're really not kind of doing a great job and you don't feel as good about it anymore, what would one do about that? I just posed a question. I have some ideas, but you could work out your own thing. A person might be disengaged when really they just have strong negative scores on cynicism only. Engagement, strong positive scores on exhaustion, cynicism, and professional efficacy. Then we could say, well, this is burnout, but maybe you could tell us some positive things. Here's a close second cousin to burnout is vicarious trauma, or what is sometimes called secondary traumatic stress. Some jobs and some roles, and it might be counterintuitive which those roles and sectors are. I'm not going to go into that today. But there's a considerable amount of reading about that, about vicarious trauma, because in social work we are exposed essentially to a lot of very difficult situations and people who are in extremis at times and who have kind of high levels of need sometimes present high levels of risk also to us as workers and to other people and to themselves. And that stuff, it takes a toll over time, and it might be considered like there's a Venn diagram where secondary stress and burnout might actually strongly overlap. And of course, there is compassion fatigue. Maybe that links quite strongly to depersonalization, for example, in the Maslow hierarchy or categories. And again, I think we kind of all know what this is. I'm guessing really it's not an uncommon experience that what might shock you in the early days of social worker kind of professional career pathway and so on no longer shocks you later on. But there comes a point if nothing shocks you and nothing takes you aback ever, then I would be kind of worried about that, where we lose that capacity for empathy and compassion for the people that we're working with and for our colleagues, of course. So I threw out a load of references there, but here is an open access thing from Community Care Inform. It's cross-cutting. It goes across both adults and children. You can just follow that and you can pick it up yourself. It comes from Grant and Kinman, who have been writing about this kind of stuff for quite some time and has some very robust research about not only what it looks like, but what you might do about it. That's kind of helpful. So really, we have talked about this earlier in the course, and we come back to it periodically. I don't see anything wrong with repetition. But I suppose really in class, then we did a little bit of exercise about what are you doing to look after yourself? And I suppose really if you're watching this video, I'd invite you to have a little go at thinking about that yourself. I'm not going to bring in a model, right? I don't have time for that. So just a little bit in the last few slides to think about critical analysis. So over the whole course, as I said earlier, we start from reflection on practice. And in fact, for the very first assignment apprentices do, they're asked to reflect on their journey into social work. Why did they make this particular career choice? And generally, we have a mix of both professional and personal influences and motivations to that. And we, even though research evidence is a little bit how would I say, inconclusive, perhaps. It's still a key part of social work practice, and we just take it as read. It's a little bit dangerous in itself, but let's just kind of say, okay, reflection is really important in our practice. We're not sure what we mean by that or what do we do with it, but nonetheless, it's a cornerstone of social work. And we move on to critical reflection, where the focus shifts more from ourselves, some of the things we bring, sometimes the bias we bring, to think about our relationship with the other person and with the organization and the complexities that are involved in those kind of layering of interactions. And perhaps an element of that is uncovering the influence of power in some of our interactions and so on and so forth. And in the final year, we try to bring all of that together and start to work on the critical analysis. As I said, in social work, quite often we are required to make decisions, sometimes quite difficult decisions, with actually very competing ethical demands, perhaps, maybe even a lack of resources and other things of this nature. But you may end up, I suppose, not to put too fine a point on it, in court, where it's going to be yes or no, that the decision will come to some sort of conclusion, and you'll be making recommendations for that. So we have to show that we can use our critical reflection and our understanding of services, our engagement with the person with lived experience, our understanding of resources and how organizations, courts, the law, how all of that functions, and to bring that together in the synthesis that says, and what I think is. So that's the aim in this final year. Again, just to reiterate, they are two of these. 1,500 words might not look like a lot, but they're usually about really quite complicated cases. In actual fact, it's quite an art to write about these things effectively in that short a word count. But people do, and we'll be able to share lots of examples of these with you over the time. So apprentices will be able to rely on their module leaders and perhaps their SRAs for feedback on these things. Um, for mentors, if you want to support your apprentice in writing about these things, the best support you can give is reflective supervision and doing the working out in that kind of context. I'd kind of be cautious about actually guiding apprentices on what they should actually write. So if somebody else is teaching a module in the university, I rarely give advice, even when asked, and I do get asked, about what a person should write in those assignments, because I'm not always entirely clear, and I'm certainly not as clear as the module leaders about what they're looking for and what good looks like, if you see what I mean. So the best support you can give is actually to think out loud with the apprentice, kind of work through those decision-making processes live in supervision. So we will actually be introducing various reflective models, some things that apprentices are not familiar with, and in particular, we will use critical incident analysis, and we'll introduce quite a few at least 2 or 3 models about how you might do that. We also have Dr. Chris Dyke, who has written a book about all of this and is now a member of the teaching staff at the university to come in and give specific input on that. And in fact, his book about critical analysis and decision making in social work is core text. So I hope that's given a sufficient overview of what's going to happen in the coming year. As I said, there will be more guidance, there will be online sessions, there will be some recorded elements that will go out to both the apprentices and the mentors. And as ever, we encourage you, if you've got a question, you want to ask something, please get in touch. Usually your apprentice, in actual fact, will be able to answer a lot of the questions if you're a mentor. Then your next step will be maybe the mentor and the apprentice need to talk to the SRA, and then you might pass it down the line to the module leaders or other members of the teaching staff at the university. I suppose my last little thought is that relationship between the mentor and the apprentice is critical to the success of the apprentice. And we've been running the course for a few years now, and we know what good looks like. And I have to say that when things are working well, it's kind of a unit of power that is invaluable and a great pleasure to be involved in. So thank you very much for your time today. Get in touch if you need to, as I have said more than one occasion. And that will do us for now, I think. And goodbye. Take care.